They say trouble in the West doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts with a whisper. She walked into the town of Red Rock at high noon. No horse, no luggage. Just a small leather pouch filled with leaves that nobody there recognized. The town saw her, and judged her in a single heartbeat. They didn't see a healer. They didn't see a woman. They saw an omen. Something foreign that needed to be cast out. And in a place built on fear, casting out the darkness always begins with a rope. By noon, the sun had baked the town of Red Rock into a hard clay plate. And at its center, they'd made their offering. A woman, strung up by her heels. Her dark hair brushing the dust with every cruel gust of wind. Above her, a slab of raw pine twisted on a rope. 2 words were smeared on it in what looked like pig's blood. Demon. Poisoner. Most folks hurried past. They'd pull their hats down low, grab their kids by the arm, and act like seeing a woman treated worse than cattle was just another part of a hard day in a hard land. But not the rider on the black stallion. He stopped. His name was Jedediah Kane, though it had been years since anyone had been brave enough or foolish enough to use it. He was a man who wore the trail like a second skin. And his silence was older than the town itself. His horse, Jericho, shifted under him, snorting at the scent of fear in the air. Jedediah placed a steady, gloved hand on the stallion's neck. He didn't move. The woman didn't scream. That's what got to him. She just hung there. A long, dark shadow of accusation against the blistering sun. Her jaw was set like granite, and her hands were bound so tight behind her back the rope had bit clean through the skin. Across the street, a curtain twitched in the window of the parsonage. A pale face peered out, then vanished. A blacksmith, his face grim, turned his young son away from the sight, shielding his eyes as if from a solar eclipse. Jedediah's gaze was fixed. He hadn't come to Red Rock for trouble. He was just passing through for salt, shells, and a reason to forget the last 100 miles. He hadn't meant to stop. He hadn't meant to care. But then, she opened her eyes. Just for a moment. They weren't pleading. They weren't broken. They were just burning. A final, defiant ember in a face that had given up on everything but the will to look her executioners in the eye. It was a look he'd seen once before. Down by the Brazos River. A girl no older, with a different face but the same fire, right before he'd followed his orders. Right before he'd kicked the crate out from under her feet. A memory he'd tried to bury under 1,000 campfires and a river of cheap whiskey. Jedediah Kane broke the stare first. He tugged on the reins, his knuckles white. He turned Jericho around and rode out of town without looking back. The heat was suffocating, the sky a pitiless, empty blue. He told himself it wasn't his fight. He told himself she was already gone. But a man can't outride a ghost. And some debts, you see, don't wash away with time. They just wait. Before the last light bled from the western sky. Jedediah Kane, a man who hadn't believed in redemption for 20 years, turned his horse around. No plan. No prayer. Just a debt that had finally come due. He caught her as she fell. A dead weight. But alive. Lighter than he'd expected, yet heavier with the sin of the town that had put her there. There was no time for thought. Only motion. Shadows were his only allies as he moved through the alleyways, the sagging fences his only guide. Jericho found him by scent, a ghost in the darkness, his hooves making barely a whisper on the packed earth. A dog barked once, sharp and distant. Jedediah didn't flinch. He swung her into the saddle before him, a fragile bundle of thorns and fever, and urged Jericho into the scrubland. They were swallowed by the night. The ride was long, measured only by the slow crawl of the moon. The landscape was a place of broken rock and skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. Once, the woman stirred in his arms. A sound escaped her lips. Not a word, just a broken note of pain. He didn't answer. He just tightened his grip, shielding her from the wind, and rode on. His shelter was less a home and more an argument against the world. A leaning shack tucked into a rocky bluff, patched with stubbornness and silence. Inside, The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and solitude. He laid her gently on the simple cot, her body burning with fever. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing a shallow, ragged thing. Jedediah moved with a quiet purpose that came from years of living alone. He didn't pray. He didn't curse. He worked. He built a small fire, his hands moving from memory. He boiled water in a blackened pot. With a strip of clean cloth and a splash of whiskey, he tended to the raw wounds at her ankles, where the rope had dug deep. She flinched in her fevered sleep, but did not wake. He left a tin cup of cool water by the cot, pulled a thin wool blanket over her. And then he stepped outside. He didn't hover. He didn't watch over her. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, and faced the dark trail that led back to Red Rock. He watched, and he waited. For the dawn he had stolen back. The fever held her for 2 days. It was a merciless fire, and she wrestled with it in the dark, her nightmares filled with swinging ropes and jeering faces. Jedediah was a ghost in her delirium. He'd leave a bowl of thin broth on the floorboards. And walk away. He'd replace the water in the tin cup. And walk away. He never spoke. He never hovered. He just existed. A silent, watchful presence on the other side of the wall. On the third morning, she woke up like a thunderclap. A single, sharp cry. High and panicked. She scrambled back against the rough wood of the wall, eyes wide and wild, her hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Her breath came in ragged sobs. Jedediah didn't go in. He just stood on the porch, his voice low and steady, speaking to the wood between them. Easy now. Silence. Then the sound of her gasping for air. You ain't in Red Rock no more, he said, his voice like the scrape of rock on rock. You're safe here. Silence answered him again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the silence of unconsciousness. It was the silence of a cornered animal. Waiting. Watching. For the rest of the day, she did not move from that corner. Her eyes. They tracked his every move as he chopped wood, as he cleaned his rifle, as he moved in and out of the shack. She was a statue carved from fear. That evening, he placed a bowl of stew and another cup of water near the doorway. He didn't look at her. He just set it down and went back to his post on the porch. An hour passed. Then another. From inside, a small sound. A scrape. He didn't turn. He just stared out at the stars that were beginning to prick the deep purple of the sky. When he went back inside long after dark, the stew was untouched. But the cup was empty. And in the quiet of that shack, something other than fear began to breathe. The fear did not vanish. It simply receded. Like a tide going out, leaving behind a shoreline of wary watchfulness. She sat upright now, her back against the wall, a wool blanket draped over her legs. She still tracked his every move, but the wild panic in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, quiet intelligence. That night, as he stirred a pot over the fire, he broke the silence that had lived between them for days. Jedediah Kane, he said to the flames. He didn't look at her. He just offered his name into the space between them, like a piece of wood for the fire. The flames crackled. The wind moaned softly outside the shack. He thought she wouldn't answer. Then, a voice, soft but not weak. Like smooth river stones. Naiya. The name landed, and stayed. He nodded once, still looking at the fire. They said you used poison on the preacher's wife. A dry, bitter sound came from her corner. Not quite a laugh. I left medicine on her step. Yarrow and willow bark. For the fever. He knew the names. His own mother had used them, a lifetime ago. Sounds like healing to me, he said. To them, she said, her voice dropping lower, anything they don't understand is poison. They fell silent again. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, she asked a question without looking at him. You fought in the war. The one with the blue and the gray coats. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He stopped stirring. His shoulders went stiff. I did. My father fought, too, she said. Not in your war. In ours. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Then she asked the question that had been hanging in the air since he first cut her down. The one that weighed more than stone. You ever kill my people? The air in the shack grew thick. He looked up from the fire, and met her gaze in the flickering light. Yes. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch. She just held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to the dying embers. Her stillness was a judgment more profound than any rage. Finally, she whispered. Then why? Why help me? He stared into the flames, at a past he could never outrun. Because the last time I was given an order like that, he said, his voice raw, I followed it. And I've been trying to bury the ghost of that girl ever since. He reached into his coat, and pulled out a small, tarnished silver medal. A reward for valor. He held it in his palm for a second, its weight a lifetime of regret. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the heart of the embers. It glowed bright red for an instant. And then the fire consumed it. The silence that fell between them after that was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of a truce. Earned in the ashes of a shared past, a weak past in the quiet rhythm of survival. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable. She taught him which roots to boil for tea. He showed her how to set a snare that never failed. They moved around the small shack not as strangers, but as two people who understood the language of loss. But the world outside their small bluff had not forgotten them. And their supplies were running low. He rode out at dawn, leaving her with his rifle and a single instruction. Don't open the door for anyone. He didn't go to Red Rock. He went east, to a dusty trading post where no one knew his face. But news travels faster than a man on horseback. It was nailed to the wall, next to a list of prices for beaver pelts. A crude drawing of a woman with dark hair and hollow eyes. His own description was there, too. A man with a quiet way and a past he didn't talk about. The words were simple. Witchcraft. Abduction. And below them, the two words that turn neighbors into wolves. $50. The air in the post was thick with it. Greed. He heard men whispering over warm beer. Talking about tracking a man and an Apache girl up into the bluffs. He saw the way their eyes drifted to the rifles racked behind the bar. $50 was more money than most of them would see in a year. It was enough to make a man righteous. It was enough to make him kill. Jedediah bought his salt and his coffee, his face a mask of stone, and left. The ride back was different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of a man listening for the sound of hoofbeats behind him. She was waiting by the door when he returned. She knew before he even dismounted. She saw it in the hard set of his jaw, in the way his eyes scanned the horizon. They're coming, he said. It wasn't a question. She stood a little straighter, her hands clasped in front of her. I can leave, she said, her voice steady. Draw them away. You don't have to. No. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. He looked at her, his eyes holding a conviction that hadn't been there a week ago. You wouldn't get a mile. He paused, then added, the words carrying the weight of his soul. We don't run from this. Not anymore. The truce was over. The storm had found them. And now, they would prepare to meet it. The sun rose the next morning not with the promise of a new day, but with the cold, hard light of a final judgment. There was no talk of plans. The plan was in their bones. The instinct of the hunted. And the hunted who refused to run. He worked like the soldier he once was. He checked the action on his rifle until it was as smooth as water. He used old floorboards to barricade the single, small window, leaving just a sliver of a gap to see through. And to shoot through. He paced the perimeter of the shack, his eyes not seeing a home, but a battlefield. He saw the choke points. The lines of fire. The dead ground where a man could be caught. She worked like the earth itself. Quietly. Methodically. She gathered sharp, flat rocks and buried them just beneath the loose soil on the narrow path leading to the door. She wove thorny branches into a hidden barrier along the back of the bluff. She sharpened a sturdy piece of oak into a spear, its point hardened in the fire from the night before. She prepared poultices and clean rags. For the wounds she knew were coming. They moved around each other in a silent dance of purpose. A nod was a command. A glance was a question. He'd hand her a tool without her asking. She'd point to a weak spot in the rocks he hadn't seen. They were two parts of a single, grim machine. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, the work was done. The shack was no longer a shelter. It was a cornered animal, showing its teeth. They sat inside as twilight bled across the land, the fading light painting the single room in shades of gray and deep orange. His rifle rested in his lap. Her spear lay beside her. They did not speak of fear. They did not speak of hope. They simply sat together in the gathering dark. And waited for the world to come and kill them. They came with the afternoon sun at their backs. A slow-moving cloud of dust that resolved itself into a dozen riders. They were not a rabble. They were organized. Led by a man on a fine gray horse, a man who wore his authority like a well-oiled gun. Marshal Thorne. They stopped 20 yards from the shack, a line of grim-faced men holding rifles, the sun glinting off the metal. The air grew still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jedediah Kane. Thorne's voice boomed, sharp and certain. You're harboring a fugitive of the law. Send the witch out now. The door to the shack creaked open. Jedediah stepped out into the harsh light. He squinted against the glare, his face unreadable. His hands were empty. He took a few slow steps forward, stopping in the open ground between his home and the riders. What law is that, Marshal? He asked, his voice calm, carrying easily in the silence. The one that hangs a woman without a trial? Thorne's face hardened. I am the law in Red Rock, Kane. And I'm here to see it done. Now step aside. Jedediah didn't move. He looked past Thorne, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the men behind him. Men he'd seen at the trading post. Men with families. I know about your kind of law, he said, his voice dropping lower. I used to serve it myself. A murmur went through the posse. 20 years ago, Jedediah continued, his eyes distant, down in Texas, my captain pointed to an Indian girl. Said she was a spy. Said she needed to hang. An example, he called it. She wasn't armed. She wasn't fighting. She was just scared. And I was a good soldier. I followed my orders. He let the words hang in the air. I tied the knot myself. I kicked the barrel out from under her feet. They gave me a medal for it. He looked directly at Marshal Thorne now, his eyes burning with a cold fire. You've come all this way for your $50. You've come to wash the town's fear away with her blood, and call it justice. But I'm telling you now. All of you. There ain't enough water in the river to wash away a sin like that. You'll carry it. Just like I have. He fell silent. He just stood there, unarmed, his confession laid bare under the unforgiving sun. A living ghost, daring them to make another. The silence that followed was a living thing. Heavy and absolute. The men in the posse shifted in their saddles, no longer looking at Jedediah, but at the ground. At their own hands. At their conscience. Marshal Thorne's face was a thundercloud of fury. He opened his mouth to bark an order, to shatter the spell. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the air. Not loud. Just clear. He's tellin' the truth. All heads turned. A young man, barely old enough to grow a beard, urged his horse forward a single step. Matthew, the blacksmith's eldest. She helped us, he stammered, but he did not look away. My sister. The fever last month. The doc said there was no hope. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, tied pouch of dried herbs. She left this on our doorstep. In the middle of the night. Didn't ask for a name. Didn't ask for a dime. He looked at Thorne, his young face filled with a conviction that shamed the older man's authority. My sister is alive today. Because of her. Get back in line, boy, Thorn roared, his voice cracking. That's witch talk, not. The boy ain't lyin', Marshal. Another voice, this one older, gravelly. A rancher named Silas, whose land bordered the creek. My horse went lame 2 weeks back. Gash on its leg, went septic. Would have had to shoot him. He gestured with his chin toward the shack. She came by the next day. Packed it with some kind of green mud. Horse was walking by the end of the week. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Never said a word. Just helped. One by one, the stories began to unfold. A woman whose child was choking. An old prospector she'd given water to on the trail. A quiet offering of food. A poultice for a burn. Small acts of kindness, delivered in silence, that had gone unnoticed by the town's loud fear. Until now. Thorn looked around wildly, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. I gave you men an order. He screamed, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip. Raise your rifles. No one moved. The rifles stayed pointed at the dirt. Then, Thorn's own deputy, a tired-looking man named Artie, slowly, deliberately, lowered his gun completely. He looked at the marshal, his face pale with shame. My wife's cough, Marshal, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The one that wouldn't quit. It was her medicine that quieted it. That was the final blow. The posse was broken. It was no longer a weapon aimed at the shack. It was just a dozen men on horses, looking anywhere but at the marshal they had followed. And just like that, Thorn was no longer a leader. He was just a man. Standing alone in the dust. His righteousness having turned to ash in his mouth. No one told them to leave. One by one, they turned their horses. Not as a group, but as men alone with their own thoughts. Young Matthew paused, placed the small pouch of herbs on a flat rock, and then rode away without looking back. Silas, the old rancher, gave Jedediah a slow, deliberate nod of respect before turning his horse toward the creek. They vanished back into the dust they came from, leaving only the settling quiet behind. Marshal Thorn was the last to go. He sat on his fine gray horse, a statue of impotent rage, and stared at the shack. Then, without another word, he yanked the reins and spurred his horse into a gallop. A man running from a town that no longer belonged to him. The dust settled. The sun dipped lower, painting the bluffs in hues of orange and deep purple. Jedediah stood there for a long time, just breathing the air. The door to the shack opened, and Naiya stepped out. She walked past the spear she had made, past the sharpened rocks, and stood beside him, her face turned toward the setting sun. She was no longer hiding in the shadows. The next morning, Jedediah took his axe and, with a few sharp swings, dismantled the barricade on the window. Light flooded the small room. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. The siege was over. He was about to start chopping the wood for the fire when he heard it. A single horse, approaching slowly. He reached for his rifle out of habit, but his hand stopped. It was Matthew, the blacksmith's boy. He dismounted, holding a heavy burlap sack. He wouldn't meet Jedediah's eye. He just looked at the ground and held out the sack. Flour, he mumbled. And some nails. My pa said you might have use for them. Jedediah took the sack. It was heavy. Thank him for me, was all he said. The boy nodded, but didn't leave. He looked toward Naiya, who was now standing on the porch. Them herbs, he asked, his voice low. The willow bark. I was wondering if you could teach me about them. Naiya looked at Jedediah. He looked at the sack of flour in one hand, and the shack that had almost been his tomb. He saw not what it was, but what it could be. A place not for hiding, but for healing. He gave a slow nod, more to himself than to anyone else. That day, they didn't just take down a barricade. They laid the first stone of something new. It didn't have a name yet. But for the first time in a long, long time, it felt like a beginning. The whispers started in the dusty corners of the territory. Not of a witch in the bluffs, but of a healer. Not of a haunted recluse, but of a safe haven. And so, they came. They came one by one, or in small, broken family units. A woman with a haunted look in her eyes, fleeing a husband's heavy hand. An old soldier whose leg had been shattered at Shiloh, and whose spirit had been shattered with it. A family whose farm had turned to dust, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs. They were the lost. The broken. The forgotten. Jedediah built. He added a room onto the shack, its walls straight and true. He raised a small barn from salvaged timber, a place for the weary horses to rest. He dug a deeper well. His hands, once instruments of a soldier's grim duty, were now the tools of a founder. Naiya healed. Her corner of the station became its heart, smelling of drying herbs and wood smoke. She tended to infected wounds, soothed fevers, and listened to stories of pain that no medicine could touch. Matthew, the blacksmith's boy, became her shadow. He learned the names of the roots, the purpose of the leaves, his hands slowly losing their clumsiness, his heart finding its purpose. One afternoon, Naiya walked to the woodpile where Jedediah had tossed the splintered sign from Red Rock. She picked it up. She took a hammer, and 3 straight nails. She walked to the wall of the new room. The place where she tended to the sick. And she nailed the sign there for all to see. Demon. Poisoner. Matthew watched her, his face filled with confusion. Why? He asked. Why would you put that lie up there? Naiya smoothed her hand over the rough wood, her fingers tracing the angry red letters. It is not a lie, she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. It is a reminder. It is not who I am. It is what I survived. It was not a mark of shame. It was a declaration. It said, this is what the world tried to name me. And I am still here. Jedediah would often sit on the porch as evening fell, not in watchful silence anymore, but just watching. Watching the smoke curl from the cook fire. Watching the children of the family he'd taken in chase each other through the dust. Listening to the quiet murmur of voices. The place didn't need a signpost on the main trail. It was known to those who needed it simply as the station. And for those who had lost their way, it was the only direction that mattered. Some nights, long after the fires had burned low and a blanket of quiet had settled over the station, Jedediah would sit on the porch and look up at the sea of stars. The ghosts of the war had finally gone quiet. He no longer dreamed of the girl by the Brazos River, her eyes filled with fire. He no longer heard the crack of rifles or the screams of dying men. Now, his sleep was filled with different sounds. The rhythm of Naiya's grinding stone. The sound of Matthew's quiet laughter as he learned a new lesson. The soft breathing of the children sleeping safely in the room he had built for them. One evening, Naiya came and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was no need. She pointed to a constellation he didn't know. He pointed to a hawk circling in the last light of dusk. It was enough. In this world, we are often told that courage is a shout. That justice is a sword. A righteous storm that sweeps through and makes things right. But the story of Jedediah Kane, and the woman named Naiya, tells a different truth. Sometimes, courage is a whisper. Sometimes, it is the simple, stubborn act of standing still when everything in you, and everyone around you, is telling you to run. Jedediah Kane wasn't a hero because he was fast with a gun or because he won a great battle. He was a hero because, on one dusty afternoon, he chose not to look away. That single choice, that one moment of staying, didn't just save a life. It created a world. He didn't build a sanctuary with timber and nails. He built it with presence. He built it by staying when it was hard. By staying when it was dangerous. By staying long enough for something new to take root in the ground he refused to give up. Because sometimes, justice isn't a storm that washes the world clean. Sometimes, it's just a single, steady light in the darkness. A place for the lost to find their way home.